I wish you could see me. I know that they're crying to you, and every new red falls from the house.
Considering everything that's going on with the Israelis right now, and the war, and the this and the that, you know, seems like you would be more interested in that.
So he would turn his phone off to honor the Sabbath. He would come in, open the junk drawer. Everyone has a junk drawer. Open the junk drawer, said Shabbat Shalom, put it in there, turn the phone off, slam the door, and he felt so free because he was unreachable.
Are you kidding me? Shabbat Shalom! They are rubbing it in our faces at this point.
One of the reasons why I always go back to Dianetics. If you really want to know the truth, Dianetics is one of the most incredible tools that allows you to tell the difference between truth and lies. It is so extraordinary. This book, by the way, In the Hands of the Freedom Movement, is a secret.
It began with the illusion of freedom. Everyone seemed to have money and access to it. But behind the glossy surfaces there were cracks in the story, places where influence moved silently through hidden channels. The world was turning its gaze toward the chaos in Israel, the wars, the accusations, and the noise. Yet in another corner of the conversation, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that began with a Sabbath phone turned off and a whisper of control disguised as peace. Charlie Kirk had been a man of conviction, grounded in faith, known for his devotion and his strict adherence to the Sabbath. He would turn off his phone, place it carefully into the junk drawer, and feel the liberation of being unreachable. Shabbat Shalom, he would think, a small act of disconnection from the world, but one that would later be read as symbolic, an isolation before the darkness closed in. For many, this ritual became proof that something deeper was happening, that forces much larger than him had already begun to circle. The whispers started with the names John and Ira Mappin, British Scientologists, owners of the imposing Camelot Castle, and names quietly inscribed in Jeffrey Epstein's infamous Black Book. Their connection to Scientology was not subtle. John had spent years studying under the church's teachings in Los Angeles, absorbing the philosophy of Dianetics, the so-called spiritual technology of L. Ron Hubbard. Publicly, he called Dianetics a tool to separate truth from lies, an extraordinary weapon for those who sought freedom. But in the shadows, people began to question what kind of freedom it truly offered, and to whom. The Mappins' reach extended beyond religious circles. They were wealthy, well-connected, and increasingly active in political spaces. And somewhere between influence and ideology, they found their way into Charlie Kirk's orbit. It began, innocently enough, as support for his organization, Turning Point USA. But when the Mappins helped establish Turning Point UK, the British arm of his movement, it became clear that this was no ordinary alliance. They weren't just donors or allies. They were builders of infrastructure, embedding themselves deep within a movement defined by Christian values. Online, observers began to connect dots. Users pointed out the strange alignment between Scientology's language of spiritual technology and the Mappins' offerings. Screenshots from their website listed it among their services, and John Mappin himself shared official Scientology videos when questioned about its meaning. To many, it was confirmation that Scientology was quietly merging with political influence, using movements like Turning Point as vessels. And then there was the connection to Epstein. The Black Book was a symbol of the elite, of secrecy, of networks that stretched across governments, media, and religion. The Mappins' names appearing there gave weight to the suspicion that this was not mere coincidence. When they attended memorials, traveled in influential circles, and stood beside political figures, it looked less like support and more like infiltration. Charlie Kirk, a devout Christian, seemed unaware of the deeper motives. He believed he was aligning with partners who shared his vision for freedom and faith. But Scientology doesn't move in the open. It infiltrates quietly, building trust before exerting control. It targets influencers, celebrities, and those with power, using their reach to extend its own. To outsiders, it appears spiritual or philosophical. To insiders, it's a mechanism of control, fueled by information, money, and silence. Experts like Rick Alan Ross had long warned that Scientology was not merely a belief system, but a power structure, one that controlled its members and guarded its influence with secrecy. Despite being a shrinking organization, it remained wealthy, owning vast properties and networks. Its members were trained to manipulate narratives, isolate targets, and create dependency. And so, in the backdrop of Charlie's growing influence, the pattern fit too neatly. What had started as collaboration became possession. The Scientologists offered money, infrastructure, and prestige. But the price of that alliance was influence, the ability to steer, shape, and ultimately to control. The deeper Charlie's organization grew in reach, the more intertwined it became with those pulling the strings behind the curtain. What had been a Christian movement for freedom was slowly being rewritten from within. And somewhere, as the Sabbath ended and the phone was turned back on, the network around Charlie tightened. He was no longer unreachable. He was being reached, watched, and used. The infiltration was complete. It was after the infiltration that the story began to twist toward betrayal. The people who had stood beside Charlie were no longer who they seemed to be. Among them was Erika Kirk, a woman whose rise had mirrored his own, former pageant queen, now CEO of Turning Point USA, polished, charismatic, and deeply connected. But as whispers turned to accusations, the image began to fracture. According to circulating rumors, the Mappins couldn't resist flaunting their friendship with her. Photos emerged from 2019 showing John and Ira Mappin in Jerusalem joined by Charlie and Erika. A pilgrimage, they said. A trip of faith. But to others, it was a symbol of entanglement. The blending of Scientology, politics, and spiritual influence under the guise of unity. Erika's own story about meeting Charlie, once seen as charming and fateful, now looked rehearsed. She had claimed to meet him by chance in an airport while returning from pilgrimage, unaware of who he was until later. But the timeline no longer made sense. Too many coincidences, too many mutual connections already in place, and then came the turning point, literally. Charlie's stance began to shift. On issues of Israel and faith, he appeared constrained, silenced. He spoke of how even online, he had less freedom to criticize certain governments than Israelis themselves. The pressure from donors, from unseen allies, grew unbearable. It was as if he had been boxed in by his own movement. After his death, the story turned darker. Conspiracy threads wove together a tapestry of betrayal and surveillance. Candace Owens spoke of 12 Israeli cell phones discovered at Utah Valley University on the day Charlie was killed. Not VPNs or routed signals, but physical devices registered in Israel, active on American soil. It was an anomaly that terrified even those high in government. Questions about who those phones belonged to and what they were doing there went unanswered, and then came Jaguar Wright's claim that the entire network surrounding Charlie was compromised. That Erika's connection to Scientology and the Mappins wasn't incidental, but instrumental. That she was the honeypot and Charlie was the target. The narrative spread like wildfire, a story of infiltration, blackmail, and elimination disguised as tragedy. Scientology, with its mastery of control and manipulation, loomed over the entire story like a shadow. Rick Ross's words echoed again. Scientology doesn't let go. It binds its targets through information and fear. Those inside cannot leave. Those outside can be destroyed. For Charlie, the closer he drew to the inner circle, the more he became a liability, a believer surrounded by deceivers. After his death, Erika appeared in interviews, rewriting his memory. She spoke of his devotion, of how he wrote her letters, of how he honored the Sabbath by turning off his phone. But the repetition of that image, the junk drawer, the phrase Shabbat Shalom, began to sound like mockery to those who knew the deeper story. It was as if the words themselves were being used to erase what had truly happened, to replace memory with myth. By the time the dust settled, the story had split into two realities. In one, Charlie was a man of faith taken too soon. In the other, he was a victim of infiltration, used by forces that wore friendship as disguise. The Mappins returned to their castle. Erika stepped further into power, and Scientology, with its invisible threads, faded once again into the background, waiting for the next believer to pull into its orbit. The phones in Utah were never explained. The alliances were never disavowed. The infiltration, if it happened, had already fulfilled its purpose. And somewhere, in the quiet after all the noise, a phone lay hidden in a junk drawer, turned off, unreachable, forever silent.
So I'm standing in the office, and our family friend was like, "You need to meet the owner." "Hi, you're the guy from the ticket line?" We had met through a family friend He had invited me to the office opening for Turning Point USA, which I know several of you guys are supporters of. And so I went to the office opening and he was like, you need to meet the CEO.
Kirk is a plant.
Charlie wrote you letters.
I know.
Every week?
Every Saturday. So he would turn his phone off to honor the Sabbath. He would come in, open the junk drawer. Everyone has a junk drawer. Open the junk drawer, said Shabbat Shalom, put it in there, turn the phone off, slam the door, and he felt so free because he was unreachable.
Are you kidding me? Shabbat Shalom. They are rubbing it in our faces at this point.
Israeli cell phones on the ground at Utah Valley University the day that Charlie Kirk was assassinated. This has completely spooked the people that are very high up in government. Now, to be clear, I don't mean that there were 12 VPNs that were switched and routed through Israel on that day. I mean that there were 12 personal cell phone accounts that were opened in Israel, okay? Like you go into Verizon in Tennessee or in Connecticut and you open your phone. I am saying that they opened their phones in Israel, those accounts in Israel, and they were on the ground on September 10th at Utah Valley University.